Miners took on Lloyd George in the middle of a war and won. The underlying argument for Russell's pluralism is that variety and conflict of opinion are healthy phenomena. Individual growth can come about only in a bracing environment. This argument sustains Russell's account of industrial organization and the reform of property rights. There, too, his concern is not with ownership in the legal sense, but with industrial morale. The great aim of industry is not to maximize production. To suppose that is to suppose that the great aim of life in general is to consume as much as possible. But people do not really want to be passive consumers on an ever-increasing scale. The aim of industry is to produce what contributes to an expansive existence without wearing ourselves out in the process. That this aim is truer to human nature than the maximization of consumption is shown by the behavior of large capitalists who expend great efforts in making money, not in order to join the idle rich, but in order to stamp their mark on the world. They compete with each other out of pride rather than greed. Vitality should decide the merits of schemes of industrial reorganization. What matters above all else is to eliminate drudgery and spread the opportunity to exercise initiative. State ownership would be worse than capitalism if all it achieved was the arrival of government-appointed managers to run industry in the same way as their capitalist predecessors had done. Something close to cooperative ownership ought to exist where it is feasible, and where it is not, as in the case of the railways, say, some other form of internal workers' democracy must be looked for. Clearly enough that techniques which cured a groundless fear of waves were not applicable to a child's fear of death. Here, Spinoza has to step in. Children can only be told that people fall into a sleep from which they never wake, and that it will not happen to them for a very long time. More crucially, they need to be encouraged to acquire so many interests outside themselves that they cease to brood upon their own fates. The man whose hopes and fears are all centered upon himself can hardly view death with equanimity, since it extinguishes his whole emotional universe. Every interest in something outside a man's own body makes his life to that degree impersonal. For this reason, paradoxical as it may seem, a man of wide and vivid interests finds less difficulty in leaving life than is experienced by some miserable hypochondriac, whose interests are bounded by his own ailments. In that frame of mind, they will see the difference between rational measures of self-defense and the groundless anxieties. It is not clear how far one can go in persuading the unconvinced about the merits of Russell's recipes. To my mind, his emphasis on a concern for the outside world as the surest remedy for pointless fear is absolutely right. But many people find themselves unable to apply the remedy and can hardly be argued into success. Unlike many free thinkers, Russell was not impressed by the personality of Christ himself. He thought him much inferior in sweetness of character to Buddha, and greatly inferior to Socrates in both character and intellect. His belief that he would return from the dead within the lifetime of his disciples was absurd, and his miracles reflect strangely on his wisdom. Russell followed John Locke in wondering why Christ should blast a fig tree, which was hardly acting strangely and not supplying figs out of season. Moreover, there was a vindictive streak in the way he threatened his enemies with hellfire and tried to persuade us into virtue as an insurance against the worm that never dies and the fire that never fades. Good-natured Christians try to persuade their 20th century readers that this is all to be taken metaphorically, but Russell will have none of it. So long as it was respectable to believe in the literal truth of such dire warnings, Christians believed in them. Only when humanitarians made Christians ashamed of their bloodthirstiness did they start saying that it was all a matter of metaphor. Unlike many free thinkers, Russell was not impressed by the personality of Christ himself. He thought him much inferior in sweetness of character to Buddha, and greatly inferior to Socrates in both character and intellect. His belief that he would return from the dead within the lifetime of his disciples was absurd, and his miracles reflect strangely on his wisdom. Russell followed John Locke in wondering why Christ should blast a fig tree, which was hardly acting strangely and not supplying figs out of season. Moreover, there was a vindictive streak in the way he threatened his enemies with hellfire and tried to persuade us into virtue as an insurance against the worm that never dies and the fire that never fades. Good-natured Christians tried to persuade their 20th century readers that this is all to be taken metaphorically, but Russell will have none of it. So long as it was respectable to believe in the literal truth of such dire warnings, Christians believed in them. Only when humanitarians made Christians ashamed of their bloodthirstiness did they start saying that it was all a matter of metaphor. Russell's defense was neither wholly convincing nor wholly unfair. What he claimed in 1915 and in 1965 was that intelligent men must be presumed to intend the consequences of their actions. Men who utter threats must be ready to carry out those threats, and they must be sincere in claiming that it would be worse to yield to the enemy than to carry out their threats. Anyone who supported a foreign policy likely to lead to war must have been willing to fight, and must have thought that the slaughter on the battlefield was a lesser evil than the success of German foreign policy. If one condition of liberty under the law is external peace, the other is to confine the state to the tasks it is suited to, and to prevent it interfering in what it is not suited to. This is the argument for arm's-length control mentioned above, supplemented by a sketch of the case for letting voluntary organizations perform many of the functions which states would otherwise perform. Russell's sketch is no more than that, but he suggests that much of economic life could be controlled by the representatives of productive and distributive enterprises, supervised by central government only to the extent that government would back agreements which commended themselves to everyone as equitable. This may strike some readers as altogether less libertarian than they expected from Russell, but the truth is that Russell thought that there was one and one only form of legitimate discipline, and that was the discipline imposed by a subject. It was not punishment that was needed or obedience to some particular person, but practice at working steadily in the way a particular problem or discipline required. Russell's willingness to lean on children quite heavily for the sake of inculcating such habits of self-control rested heavily on his belief that, once such habits were acquired, they were liberating rather than constraining, since they made it possible to explore the intellectual universe in a way that was otherwise impossible. What shocked readers in the 1920s was his breezily secular attitude to sexual education for children. It was this which provoked innumerable stories about Beacon Hill, all of them false, though some were at least ben trovato. There never was a visiting vicar who exclaimed, "Good God!" on meeting a naked child on the doorstep, only to be told, "There is no God," though it seems a pity that it never happened. Russell was more concerned with the state's disposition to impose sanctions on individual attempts at nonconformity, and the explanation he sought for the state's hostility to variety and nonconformism was that states which were constantly preparing to fight their neighbors inevitably tried to achieve a degree of internal unity, which was simply liberticide. The view that obedience is the supreme virtue is a thought that comes naturally to a state which sees itself as an armed force in which the willingness of everyone to obey orders is vital to survival. Unless international peace can be guaranteed, internal liberty is precarious. This was a view which Russell never abandoned. Moreover, by this time he accepted that controversial methods of protest or of gaining power might be needed. He had nearly fallen out with the Quaker wing of the NCF over his unabashed support for violent revolution in Russia, and as a consistent utilitarian about institutions, he was by no means an absolutist about the constitutional proprieties. In Democracy and Direct Action, he raised the question whether workers should engage in political strikes. This was a very live issue at the time, for after the war there was a good deal of talk of the political general strike, which featured so prominently in syndicalist theory. Some workers and almost all employers thought the time might be ripe for an unconstitutional push for socialism. Russell was writing for a guild socialist audience. In essence, he argued that workers would be justified in striking to bring about industrial self-government, if it would work. There was no reason in principle why they should not employ the strike weapon to replace the property rights of existing owners by rights which would-be managers would have to earn by election. In practice, they should be cautious. It was imprudent to outrage the community at large. Socialists could influence the government if they had public opinion on their side, but it was immoral to misuse whatever power they had to exploit or bully the rest of the community. To take an example dear to the intellectual, printers might occasionally make their employers print their non-capitalist view of the world to redress the balance, but to use their power to impose a censorship of their own was simply intolerable. Russell deftly incorporated the defense of democracy, nationality, and group autonomy into a vision of a world in which power is normally and naturally devolved as far as possible. To strike to bring that about was hardly to espouse the Red Terror. If he gives the impression that, once we have agreed on his principles, we shall be able to implement them within a few weeks or months, that touch of glibness hardly detracts from the impressively coherent case for controlled disobedience as a way of preserving the good Constitution. It is because everyday life is so unsatisfying that states can rally their citizens behind policies which defend national prestige and nothing more useful. That explains why so many young men were ready to go and fight. It was not that they enjoyed killing other people, let alone that they had any great enthusiasm for being blown to bits themselves. They needed to exert themselves strenuously in some important task, and if they could not do so in peace, they were ready to go off to find a purpose in life at the front. Russell's depth psychology is not quite that of either Freud or Adler, although he knew of their work, for he did not believe either in the death wish suggested by Freud or in the will to power uncovered by Adler. Nonetheless, it plainly has something in common with their appeal to the pressures of the unconscious on conscious behavior. Secondly, the aim of appealing to the psychological substructure of social life was to provide foundations for a better political theory than old-fashioned rationalist liberalism. Whether Russell achieved this, and quite what he thought would replace old-fashioned liberalism, it is not easy to say. What is clear, though, is that Russell thinks that old-fashioned liberalism exaggerated the role of reason in human affairs and overstated the desire to be happy. It is no good telling people that it is a mistake to fight, and that war will not make them prosperous or happy. They will not listen. They will go off to fight, not happy in the usual sense, but exultant and fulfilled. Stripped of parliamentary verbiage, the fundamental fact about the European situation is that all the great powers of Europe have precisely the same objects: territory, trade, and prestige. In pursuit of these objects, no one of the great powers shrinks from wanton aggression, war, and chicanery. But owing to the geographical position of Germany and her naval supremacy, England can achieve all its purposes by wars outside Europe, whereas English and Russian policy has shown that Germany cannot achieve its aims except by a European war. We have made small wars because small wars were what suited our purposes. Germany has made a great war because a great war was what suited Germany's purpose. The bulk of the Entente policy, 1904 to 1915, is devoted to showing that in Morocco, in Persia, and generally through the operation of the Entente, France, Britain, and Russia consistently excited German fears of losing out in the race for colonies and markets, in a way which dispelled any claim that their policies were motivated by something more high-minded than greed. Russell's view of what was at stake between Britain and Germany never altered. In 1914 and 1918, he argued the same case. No real difference of economic interest separated them, and the war was purely a matter of national pride.